It was a cold afternoon in early spring when the town's cultural center opened its doors for the annual piano recital. The event had become something people looked forward to every year. Students, teachers, and families from all around gathered to celebrate music and talent. The small auditorium was filled with chatter, laughter, and the sound of pianos being tuned one last time before the show began. Bright banners hung on the walls. The smell of polish and stage dust filled the air, and the excitement was almost visible. In the middle of all that noise and color, a woman quietly stepped through the main doors. She wasn't young, nor did she look like she was here to impress anyone. Her clothes were simple, a long beige coat, plain shoes, and a scarf that had seen better days. She carried a small leather bag and a folded sheet of music that looked worn and creased at the edges, as if it had been touched and retouched hundreds of times. She walked slowly, almost cautiously, as if afraid of disturbing the rhythm of the place. The volunteers at the front desk were busy checking names off the list. When it was her turn, she gently placed her invitation on the table. The young man scanning the papers looked at it, then at her, and for a second seemed confused. "You're performing?" he asked, his tone more surprised than curious. She gave a soft nod. "Yes, my name should be on the list." He scanned again, then found her name somewhere near the end. "Ah, yes, there you are. You'll be the 12th performer. Please wait backstage until your turn." She smiled faintly and thanked him, stepping aside, but she could already feel the quiet glances around her. Most of the other performers were young, students with fresh suits and dresses, their parents helping them with last-minute touch-ups. A few teachers walked around giving tips or calming nerves. No one looked like her. She didn't carry herself with the pride of a trained artist or the excitement of a student ready to shine. She looked like someone simply there to share something personal. Backstage, the air was full of nerves and whispered pep talks. One girl in her teens practiced finger movements on an invisible keyboard. Another boy tapped his shoes impatiently. When the woman sat on a nearby chair, some of the students looked her way. One whispered to another, "Is she a parent or something?" They both giggled quietly. She pretended not to hear. Minutes passed. The first few performers went on stage. The muffled sound of applause reached backstage each time someone finished. Everyone waited for their turn, rehearsing in their heads, humming quietly or tapping their knees. The woman sat still, her eyes fixed on her folded sheet. Every once in a while, she'd close her eyes and smile softly, as though listening to something only she could hear. Her hands, though calm, bore signs of age. They weren't the hands of a pampered pianist. They were slightly rough, showing the kind of life that had worked, cleaned, or perhaps held on through hard times. Yet when she touched the edges of her music sheet, her fingers moved with care like a mother holding something fragile. An hour passed. The recital was in full swing. The audience clapped politely after each performance, sometimes with bursts of cheer when a familiar name appeared. The young performers were good, some even excellent, but after a while the music started to blend together. Fast fingers, loud chords, dramatic endings. Impressive, yes, but not exactly moving. The audience started to lose focus, whispering among themselves between performances. Meanwhile, the woman remained where she was, her expression calm, as though she didn't mind waiting. When the host, a man in his 50s wearing a shiny suit, came backstage to check on the remaining performers, his eyes paused briefly on her. "Ma'am, are you one of the participants?" he asked politely. "Yes," she said simply, handing him her music sheet when he asked for it. He scanned it and raised an eyebrow. "This isn't a known piece. It's my own composition," she said softly. He blinked, unsure how to respond. "Ah, I see. Well, you'll be performing after the young gentleman from the academy. Just be ready when I call your name." She nodded again, smiling kindly, and the host walked off, scratching his head. He probably assumed she was someone's relative trying her luck for fun. When the 11th performer finished, the host returned to the stage. His voice echoed through the speakers, slightly exaggerated with excitement. "Up next we have a special performance," he said, glancing at his note card. "Please welcome, Miss Clara." He mispronounced her last name slightly but didn't notice. "Let's give her a round of applause." The applause was polite but half-hearted. Some people in the audience were whispering again, curious but unconvinced. Who was she? Why hadn't they heard of her before? And why was she performing at her age in a recital filled with students? As she walked onto the stage, the lights seemed brighter than before. She blinked a few times, her steps careful and measured, The hall, though small, suddenly felt enormous. She approached the piano, a beautiful black grand with polished keys that gleamed under the spotlights. She placed her old sheet on the stand and adjusted the stool. The murmur from the crowd faded slowly as she sat down. From her seat, she could see faces in the front row. Some looked curious, others impatient. A young man near the center folded his arms, whispering something to the person beside him. A couple of students backstage peeked through the curtain, smirking quietly. It wasn't cruel, just the kind of careless laughter people share when they think they already know what's coming. Clara took a deep breath. Her fingers hovered over the keys, not touching them yet. She didn't rush. Instead, she looked down for a moment, her mind wandering far from the stage. Maybe she was remembering the first time she ever played. Maybe she was thinking of the old piano back home, the one that squeaked on certain notes but always sang the truth when she played. Her heart was steady. The noise in the hall dimmed into silence. Then she pressed the first note. It was soft, so soft that the sound almost disappeared into the air. But something about it made people look up. There was a strange warmth in that tone, like a whisper that carried meaning beyond words. Her second note followed, then a third, and slowly a melody began to take shape. It wasn't a loud or fast tune, it was simple, graceful, and alive. Every key she touched seemed to tell a story that needed no explanation. For the first minute, the audience didn't move. It wasn't what they expected. They had prepared for another technical display, maybe a bit of showmanship. But this was different. The music had a quiet honesty to it. It wasn't trying to prove anything. It was just speaking. Backstage, one of the young performers stopped fidgeting and listened. The boy who had laughed earlier lowered his phone, his expression changing. Even the host, who had gone off stage to check the next performer's order, paused behind the curtain, peeking out with surprise. There was something about her music that softened the whole atmosphere. Her hands moved slowly but with certainty. Every chord, every shift had purpose. It was the kind of playing that came from life, not lessons. The kind that came from loss, patience, and small joys. The audience couldn't see it, but inside her, memories were unfolding. Quiet kitchens where she once played for someone she loved. Lonely nights when music was the only companion. And small moments of peace that had kept her going when words had failed. She wasn't playing to win. She wasn't trying to impress. She was remembering, and in doing so, she was giving everyone in the hall a glimpse of something deeply human. A few rows back, the maestro, an older man who had been judging the performances with a practiced eye, adjusted his glasses and leaned forward. He had been unimpressed for most of the evening, but now he found himself still, caught by a melody that seemed familiar yet unknown. He couldn't place it, but it stirred something within him. As the melody grew, it carried a sense of ache and peace intertwined. There were no harsh jumps or sudden flares. It flowed like a river that had known both storms and calm. The audience, once restless, was now silent, not out of politeness, but because no one wanted to break the spell. The young man who had mocked her earlier felt his chest tighten slightly. He didn't understand why, but her music reminded him of his grandmother's old lullabies. The girl who had practiced her finger drills backstage realized her own playing, though perfect, had never sounded this alive. On stage, Clara's expression remained gentle, her eyes half closed, lost in the moment. The stage lights reflected softly off her face, and for a brief second, the years seemed to disappear. She looked neither old nor young, just timeless. When she played the final note, she didn't lift her hands immediately. She let it linger, fade, and dissolve into silence. Then she slowly lowered her hands to her lap and looked up. The hall was utterly still. No one clapped at first. They were too moved to react. Then one person, someone near the back, started clapping softly. Another joined, and then the sound grew, spreading across the room. Within moments, the applause filled the hall, genuine and heartfelt. Clara gave a small bow, her smile quiet but full of peace. She stood, gathered her music sheet, and walked off stage as humbly as she had entered. She didn't look around for approval or praise. For her, the music had already done what it was meant to do. Backstage, everyone who had once doubted her stared in silence. No one said a word, but their eyes followed her as she passed. She smiled gently at them, not with pride, but with kindness. As she reached the exit door, she paused for a moment, listening to the lingering echo of applause behind her. Then she walked out, leaving behind a hall that would not soon forget the quiet woman who had played like the piano itself had been waiting for her all along. After her performance ended, the applause faded slowly, but the feeling she left behind stayed in the room long after she walked off the stage. Some people were still whispering about her, trying to make sense of what they had just heard. Others sat quietly, lost in thought, staring at the piano as if expecting her to come back and play again. Backstage, the host was still standing near the curtain. For a moment he looked speechless. He had seen hundreds of performances over the years, but very few had moved him like this one. He wasn't even sure why. It wasn't a perfect performance in a technical sense. There were small pauses, a few uneven transitions, but something about the way she played had gone beyond technique. It had reached the heart. The next performer, a confident young man from the local academy, looked uneasy. He had spent months practicing a fast classical piece filled with flourishes meant to impress. But now, after hearing her music, his piece suddenly felt empty. He kept tapping his fingers nervously and whispering to himself, trying to gather the same energy he had before. The host came over and reminded him, "You're next." He nodded, straightened his jacket, and walked toward the stage. But even before he sat down, the atmosphere had changed. The audience still seemed to be recovering from the emotion Clara's piece had stirred. When he started playing, his notes were loud and quick, but they didn't land the same way. The crowd clapped politely afterward. Yet it was clear that something in the air had shifted. Meanwhile, the woman herself was sitting quietly in the hallway outside the auditorium. She had stepped out to breathe. Her heart still beat a little faster than usual, but her expression was calm. She folded the music sheet and placed it carefully back into her bag. She didn't expect praise or compliments. She hadn't come for attention. She came because the song needed to be heard one last time. A few minutes later, the door opened and one of the volunteers, a young woman, walked out. She smiled nervously and said, "Excuse me, ma'am. The judges would like to speak with you if you don't mind." Clara seemed surprised. "With me?" "Yes," the volunteer said, nodding quickly. "They asked if you could come back inside for a moment." She stood up slowly and followed the volunteer back into the hall. By now, the event was almost over. The audience was chatting again, waiting for the closing speech and the announcement of awards. The judges sat in a row near the front, flipping through their notes. The maestro, the eldest among them, looked up as she approached. He gestured kindly for her to sit beside the stage for a moment. His eyes were thoughtful, curious, almost searching. "Ma'am," he began softly. "That piece you played, may I ask where it came from?" "It's my own composition," she said, her tone calm. "I wrote it many years ago." He nodded slowly, still studying her. "It's a rare thing," he said. "Your melody carries something I haven't heard in years. It feels lived in. Every phrase feels like it has seen time pass through it." She smiled gently, unsure how to respond. "I suppose it has," she said quietly. The maestro's eyes softened. He leaned back and crossed his hands. "Did you study music formally?" "Only for a short while," she answered. "I learned most of what I know by playing. I used to teach children for some years, but I stopped when life became too busy." He nodded again. "And now?" "Now I play for myself," she said, her voice simple but sincere. "And for anyone willing to listen." The maestro didn't speak for a while. Around them, the noise of the hall continued. People chatting, footsteps, laughter, but their little corner seemed quiet. He finally said, "Would you mind sharing your sheet with me later? I'd like to study it. There's something special about your phrasing. It reminds me of a time when music was written from the heart, not the head." She hesitated for a second, then nodded. Of course, he thanked her warmly and she stood to leave. But before she turned away, he added softly, "You should know. Not everyone here will understand what you played tonight. Some only listen for speed or perfection. But true music, real music, isn't about that. What you gave us was rare." Her eyes glistened slightly. She bowed her head and said, "Thank you, sir. That means more than you know." As she left, the maestro watched her go with quiet respect. He didn't know her story yet, but he could feel it was one worth knowing. Outside, the night air was cool. The city lights shimmered across the street as cars passed. She walked slowly toward the bus stop, her shoes tapping softly on the pavement. The wind brushed her face, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself a small sigh of relief. She hadn't expected the night to turn out this way. At the bus stop, a few people waited silently. She sat down, holding her music bag close to her chest. Her reflection stared back at her from the glass shelter. The same tired eyes, the same quiet smile. She thought about the years that had passed, the small moments that led to this one night. Once, long ago, she had dreamed of performing for large audiences, of writing songs that would travel far beyond her town. But life had other plans. She got married young, then spent years working small jobs, raising children, caring for her husband through his illness. Music became something she did in the evenings after everything else was done. It was her comfort, her escape, her prayer. When her husband passed away, she stopped playing for a long time. The piano sat in the corner of her small living room untouched. Dust began to gather on the keys. Every time she walked by, she felt the pull to sit and play. But something inside her hesitated. The silence in the house had grown too heavy. Then one day, months later, she sat down and opened her old music sheets. Among them was the unfinished melody she had started writing when her husband was still alive. It was the same piece she had played tonight. Slowly, she began to finish it, not with sorrow, but with peace. Every note felt like a conversation with the past, a way of saying goodbye and thank you at the same time. The bus arrived. She climbed aboard and sat near the window. As the city lights moved past, she rested her head against the glass and closed her eyes. The sound of the bus engine hummed softly, almost like a background to her thoughts. She thought about the people in the hall, the young ones with shining shoes, the judges, the maestro. She smiled faintly, imagining their surprised faces, not because she wanted to prove anything, but because it reminded her that life still had ways of surprising even those who thought their best days were behind them. When she reached her stop, she stepped off and began the short walk home. The street was quiet, lined with dim lamps and closed shops. Her small house sat at the corner, a warm light glowing from the window. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The familiar smell of tea and old wood greeted her. The piano stood in its usual place near the window, the same one she had played for years. She walked over, ran her fingers gently across the keys and smiled. The house may have been small and silent, but tonight it felt alive again. She set her bag down, took off her coat and sat for a moment in the old armchair nearby. Her hands still tingled from playing. She thought about the maestro's words. Real music is written from the heart. She whispered to herself, maybe that's all I ever did. Across town, the maestro sat in his office long after the recital ended. The other judges had left, the stage crew was cleaning up, and the chairs were being stacked. But he remained at his desk, turning the pages of the score he had copied from her sheet. His trained eyes followed each note, and he could almost hear her playing again in his head. He closed his eyes for a moment and smiled. She plays like someone who has seen both joy and pain, he murmured. Someone who understands silence as much as sound. He made a mental note to find her the next day. There was something about her music that he didn't want to lose. The next morning, the results of the recital were posted online. Most of the participants rushed to check who had won the awards. Some felt disappointed, others proud. Clara didn't even look. She hadn't given her email when she signed up. She didn't care for prizes. For her, the night had already given her more than she hoped for. Still, later that day when she went to buy groceries, a familiar face appeared near the bakery counter. It was one of the young girls from backstage, the same one who had laughed quietly before her performance. The girl approached hesitantly, holding a small box of pastries. "Excuse me," she said softly. "You were the woman who played last night, right?" Clara nodded. "Yes, I just wanted to say, your song was beautiful," the girl said shyly. "I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went home and told my mom. She cried when I played the video for her." Clara smiled warmly, touched. "Thank you. That means a lot to me." The girl nodded again and smiled before leaving, her face glowing with a kind of quiet admiration. When Clara stepped back outside, the sun was shining softly through the clouds. She stood still for a moment, letting the light warm her face. She had spent most of her life believing her music no longer mattered to anyone. But last night and this morning had proved something different. Sometimes the world forgets about quiet people. It overlooks the ones who don't shout for attention. But every once in a while, life gives them a stage, not to make them famous, but to remind them that what they carry inside still has meaning. She took a deep breath, smiled to herself, and walked home, her steps lighter than before. The next morning started like any other. The small house was quiet except for the sound of the kettle whistling on the stove. The sunlight touched the curtains, filling the room with a warm, soft glow. Clara sat at her small dining table with a cup of tea, her thoughts still drifting back to the night before. Every detail came back to her. The stage lights, the faces in the crowd, the way the room had gone silent when she began to play. She didn't tell anyone about it. There was no one to tell. Her children lived in other cities, busy with their own families. She rarely spoke of herself anyway. People in her neighborhood only knew her as the quiet woman who gave piano lessons to a few kids after school. To them she was ordinary, kind, and polite. Nothing more. But inside she felt something different now. It wasn't pride. It wasn't even excitement. It was peace, the kind that comes when a long closed door quietly opens again. She had faced the piano after years of silence, and for a moment the world had listened. After finishing her tea, she went to the piano by the window. The morning light made the keys shine faintly. She sat down and touched the same worn edges that she had touched for years. The old instrument creaked a little, but it responded with warmth when she pressed a few keys. She smiled softly. Just then there was a knock at the door. It was gentle, almost hesitant. She stood up, a bit surprised. She wasn't expecting anyone. When she opened it, she saw the maestro standing there holding a small folder. He smiled politely. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," she said, stepping aside to let him in. He walked in slowly, looking around. The house was simple. Shelves filled with old books, a few framed photographs, and the piano that seemed to own the space. He nodded in quiet admiration. "You live surrounded by music," he said. "I suppose I do," she replied with a small laugh. He placed the folder on the piano. "I came because your piece from last night. It's been on my mind. I couldn't sleep, honestly. I kept hearing it over and over again. I've studied music all my life, but there was something in your melody that reminded me why I fell in love with it in the first place." She looked at him, slightly embarrassed. "It's just a simple tune." He shook his head. "No, it's more than that. It's honest. That's what makes it powerful." They sat down and he asked if she would play it again. She hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the keys, and began to play. The same gentle melody filled the small room, but this time it felt even more intimate. The sound mixed with the ticking of the wall clock and the rustle of the trees outside. The maestro closed his eyes as she played, listening carefully. He noticed small details he hadn't caught the night before. The slight pause between two phrases, the soft tremble in the middle section that carried a hint of longing. When she finished, the silence that followed felt like part of the music itself. He opened his eyes slowly. "That," he said softly, "is the kind of music the world forgets it needs." She smiled faintly. "It came from a quiet place. I never wrote it to be performed. It was just something I played for myself." He nodded. "And that's why it sounds pure. You weren't trying to impress anyone. You were just speaking truth in your own language." They talked for a while after that. The maestro asked about her past, where she had learned, how she started composing. She told him about the old upright piano she'd had as a child, about her parents who loved folk tunes, and how she would sit by the window for hours trying to copy the melodies she heard on the radio. She spoke about her husband, too, how he had saved money for years to buy her a piano after they married, even when times were tough. "I stopped playing after he passed away," she said quietly. The piano felt too loud in an empty house. The maestro's face softened. "But you found your way back to it." "Yes," she said, because silence started to feel louder. For a while, they just sat there without speaking. Outside, children's laughter floated through the open window as school let out. The sound made both of them smile. After a moment, he turned to her and said, "I'd like to help you record that piece." She blinked in surprise. "Record it?" "Yes," he said. "I have friends at the local conservatory. They have a small studio. If you're comfortable, we could record your melody properly. Not for fame or awards, but simply to preserve it. Music like that shouldn't disappear." She looked unsure. "I don't know. It's been so long. I've never recorded anything before. I'll handle everything," he assured her kindly. "You just need to play." She thought for a moment, then nodded slowly. "All right," she said softly. "If you think it's worth recording." He smiled warmly. "It's more than worth it." The following week they met at the conservatory. It was a beautiful old building with tall windows and the faint scent of varnish and coffee in the hallways. Students hurried past carrying sheet music, whispering to one another, barely noticing the quiet woman who walked beside the maestro. When they entered the small studio, Clara looked around in awe. The walls were lined with panels, microphones hung from the ceiling, and in the center stood a grand piano that looked almost too perfect to touch. The sound engineer greeted them and adjusted the setup. The maestro handed her the sheet of her composition, though she barely needed it. She sat down, took a deep breath, and placed her fingers on the smooth keys. When she began to play, the room transformed again. The sound was clearer, fuller, but the feeling was the same, that same raw honesty. The engineer sat completely still, his eyes fixed on the recording levels, almost afraid to make a sound. The maestro stood nearby, arms crossed, his expression calm but deeply moved. After she finished, there was silence again. The engineer looked at her and said softly, "That was beautiful." She smiled modestly. "Thank you." They did a few more takes, though the first one already felt perfect. Each time she played, it carried a slightly different emotion, sometimes softer, sometimes slower. The maestro finally stopped her after the third recording. "That's it," he said. "You don't need to play it again. The heart can only speak once with the same truth." She nodded, grateful for his understanding. After the session, they sat together outside on a bench near the garden. The conservatory's fountain trickled quietly nearby. Clara held a small copy of the recording in her hands. She looked at it with a kind of wonder, as though she couldn't believe her music now existed beyond her living room. The maestro turned to her and said, "I'd like to share this at our next concert. Would that be all right with you?" She hesitated. "You mean play it for an audience?" "Yes, I'll perform it myself, or if you prefer, you could." She laughed softly. "Oh no, I think one performance is enough for me. But if you want to play it, I'd be honored." He smiled. Then it settled. Over the next few days, word spread quietly among the music community. The maestro, known for his high standards, was preparing to play a new piece composed by an unknown woman from the same town. People grew curious. Some thought it was just a favor. Others wondered if she was a forgotten composer from the past. When the night of the concert arrived, the hall was packed. The lights dimmed and the maestro stepped onto the stage. Before he played, he spoke briefly to the audience. "Tonight's final piece," he said, "is one that touched me deeply. It wasn't written for fame or attention, but out of pure feeling. Sometimes music doesn't need to shout to be heard. Sometimes it only needs to be honest." Then he sat down and began to play her melody. As soon as the first note filled the hall, a hush fell over the audience. The same warmth that had moved people at the recital returned, but now in a room of hundreds. The melody carried through the air, tender and full of life. People closed their eyes, letting it sink in. When it ended, there was a long silence before the applause began. The sound grew, wave after wave, until the whole hall was standing. The maestro stood and bowed slightly, then looked toward the side of the stage where Clara sat quietly, hidden behind the curtain. He gestured for her to step forward. At first, she shook her head, but the crowd had already turned toward her. The applause grew louder, warmer. Slowly, she walked out, her steps shy but steady. When she reached the center of the stage, the maestro took her hand and raised it gently. For a moment, she couldn't speak. The lights, the faces, the sound, it all felt like a dream she never thought she'd live again. She smiled softly and said just one line, "Thank you for listening." That night, as she walked home under the quiet sky, she carried nothing but a small recording in her bag. Yet it felt heavier than anything she had ever owned. Heavy with meaning, with memories, with life. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel like her music had faded into the background. She felt seen, not because people clapped for her, but because her heart had finally been heard. And somewhere deep down, she knew that even if no one ever remembered her name, her melody would continue to live, not on paper, but in the hearts it had quietly touched. When the first few notes faded into the air, the hall was wrapped in complete silence. It was the kind of silence that didn't come from boredom or impatience, but from something deeper, like the audience was afraid to move and break the fragile beauty that had filled the room. Clara's fingers hovered above the piano for a breath, her eyes still closed before she began again, letting the next part of her melody bloom. Every note carried warmth, pain, and something that couldn't be explained in words. The audience, who only minutes ago had been whispering and waiting for her to finish quickly, now sat frozen in their seats. A woman in the front row who had been scrolling through her phone earlier slowly set it down on her lap. A young boy who had been fidgeting beside his father stopped swinging his legs and stared at the piano, like he was seeing something new for the first time. Clara wasn't playing to impress anyone. It was clear from the way she moved, from how her fingers pressed the keys so gently like each one held a memory. She wasn't chasing speed or trying to show off technique. She was telling a story, and somehow every person in the room could feel they were part of it. The melody shifted, becoming softer, almost fragile. Her hands trembled slightly, but the tremble only made the music feel more human. Each pause, each delicate sound carried emotion that no words could capture. People began to realize they weren't just listening to music. They were listening to a lifetime. The maestro, who had been sitting still with his pen in hand, now leaned forward. His eyes, which usually remained cold and analytical during performances, softened as he watched her play. He had heard thousands of pianists before, students, professionals, even prodigies. But something about this was different. It wasn't about skill. It was about truth. There was honesty in every movement, every chord, every fragile breath Clara took between notes. As the piece continued, flashes of memory seemed to pass behind her eyes. She had played this very melody years ago, long before anyone had cared to listen. Back then she had been younger, full of dreams but burdened by life's weight. There were days when she played only to calm her heart after loss, days when the piano was the only voice she had left. This melody had grown with her through all those years, through love, heartbreak, loneliness, and quiet resilience. And now, sitting on that grand stage surrounded by strangers, she was finally letting it speak again. In one corner of the hall, an older man blinked away tears. He didn't know why, but something in the music reminded him of his late wife. It made him remember the mornings when she used to hum while making breakfast, the sound of her laughter filling their little kitchen. Another person, a young music student, felt a strange warmth spread through her chest. She realized that what she had been chasing in her endless hours of practice wasn't perfection, it was emotion. It was the ability to make someone feel something real. The melody swelled, then quieted again like the tide. Clara's hands glided across the keys with ease, but every motion carried years of quiet struggle. She wasn't just performing. She was remembering. The old hall lights reflected softly on her face, showing the faint lines of time, the evidence of both sorrow and wisdom. But there was peace in her expression, a calmness that came from acceptance, not from giving up. The maestro could no longer hide his emotion. He recognized something familiar in the piece. At first, he thought it was a variation of an old composition by a composer long forgotten. But then, as certain phrases repeated, his eyes widened slightly. No, this wasn't a copy or an imitation. It was something original, something pure. He started to realize he might be hearing an unreleased work that no one had ever known about. Or perhaps more astonishingly, it was her own creation. He looked down at her sheet of music, and even from a distance he could tell it was handwritten. Old, with faded ink and creases on the edges. His breath caught in his throat. This wasn't a performer playing someone else's piece. This was an artist sharing her heart, her history, and her pain through a melody that had waited too long to be heard. By now, the audience was completely lost in the sound. Some had their eyes closed. Others leaned forward unconsciously, as if being pulled closer to the piano. The once restless crowd was now bound by one emotion: reverence. They didn't know who she was or where she had come from, but they knew they were witnessing something rare. Clara's fingers began to slow as the melody reached its final passage. The notes became more delicate, almost like whispers. She pressed the keys with such gentleness that they barely made a sound, yet the silence between them felt powerful. Her breathing was steady, calm, and every movement seemed guided by something deeper than conscious thought. Then a single high note rang out, clear, pure, and almost aching. It lingered in the air for a few seconds before fading away. That note felt like a goodbye, a final release of all that she had carried for so long. And just like that, the piece ended. The silence that followed was unlike any other silence. It was full of emotion, like the air itself had been changed. Clara kept her hands resting on the piano for a moment, as if afraid to break the spell. She finally lifted her gaze and looked toward the audience. For a second, she thought maybe no one had understood, maybe no one cared. But when she saw the faces in front of her, silent, still, and filled with awe, she realized they did. They all did. The maestro sat motionless for a long moment, his pen forgotten in his lap. His eyes glistened slightly as he stared at her. He had spent a lifetime judging performances, scoring precision, noting flaws, and praising technique. But this was beyond any of that. It wasn't something that could be measured. This was the kind of music that reminded him why he fell in love with it in the first place. He finally exhaled softly, his voice barely a whisper as he said, "Remarkable." Clara gave a small nod, not out of pride but gratitude. She wasn't looking for applause or approval. For her, the music had already done its job. It had spoken the words she couldn't say, and then it happened. The audience began to clap. Slowly at first, as if they were afraid to disturb the stillness, but then stronger, louder until the hall echoed with applause. People rose from their seats clapping with genuine emotion. It wasn't polite applause. It was heartfelt, raw, and full of admiration. The young man who had mocked her earlier was now standing, clapping with everyone else. His expression changed from smug amusement to disbelief and respect. The host, who had barely paid attention before, now looked humbled, realizing he had almost underestimated something extraordinary. The maestro remained seated for a moment longer, still processing what he had just heard. He leaned slightly toward one of the assistants beside him and asked in a quiet tone, "Do we know her background?" The assistant shook his head. "No, sir. She just registered this morning. No teacher listed, no school, no record." The maestro nodded slowly, still staring at Clara, who had stepped back from the piano and was now giving a small, shy bow. He could tell she wasn't used to such attention. There was no arrogance, no dramatic gestures, just calmness. As the clapping continued, something unexpected happened. The maestro stood up. It was rare, almost unheard of, for him to give a standing ovation. The audience noticed and followed his lead, and soon the entire hall was on its feet. Clara looked overwhelmed, her eyes glassy but her smile faint and peaceful. She gave another small bow, pressing her hands together as if in thanks. The maestro's mind was racing. He couldn't stop thinking about that melody, those transitions, the depth of emotion in each chord. He wanted to ask her everything, where she learned, who taught her, how she wrote such a piece. But for the moment, he simply stood there, letting the applause wash over the room, letting her have that moment she had long deserved. When the applause finally quieted, Clara gathered her sheet and turned to leave the stage. The maestro stepped forward slightly, calling out softly, "Miss, one moment, please." She paused and looked at him. He approached her slowly, smiling warmly. "That composition, is it yours?" Clara nodded modestly. "It is. I wrote it many years ago." He blinked in quiet amazement. "It's one of the most honest performances I've heard in my career." She gave a humble smile. "I'm glad it reached you. That's all I ever wanted. For it to be heard once." The maestro didn't reply for a second. He just looked at her, realizing that he had met someone who didn't play for fame, money, or praise, but simply for the love of music itself. And that, in his eyes, was the rarest kind of artist there was. Clara walked off the stage, the sound of the applause still echoing softly behind her. Her steps were calm and unhurried. The noise of the crowd faded as she reached the back hallway, where the light was dim and quiet again. She placed her sheet of music gently into her bag, almost like putting away a piece of her soul. And for the first time in many years, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: peace. The sound of the applause still lingered in the air long after Clara had stepped off the stage. People were still talking about her performance even as the next name was announced. Some clapped again when they saw her pass by in the hallway, and others whispered, trying to remember the tune she played. It was as if her melody had imprinted itself on everyone who heard it. Clara walked slowly, clutching the handle of her small, worn-out bag. The noise of the hall was behind her now, replaced by the soft hum of the corridor lights. She didn't rush to leave. For a while, she just stood there in the quiet, letting her heart calm down. She wasn't used to applause. For most of her life, her music had been something private, something that lived only within the four walls of her small home. A staff member came running up to her, slightly out of breath. "Ma'am, the maestro asked if you could wait. He wants to speak with you," he said politely. Clara hesitated. She didn't expect that. She nodded quietly and followed him back toward the side of the stage where the judges sat. The audience was still buzzing. But when the maestro saw her approach, he stood up at once. He greeted her with genuine warmth in his voice. "That was unforgettable," he said softly. "I've heard countless performances, but yours—" He paused, almost struggling to find the right words. It wasn't just music. It was a story, and it moved everyone here. Clara gave a small smile. "Thank you. I'm glad it touched them." The maestro looked at her for a moment longer, his expression full of curiosity. "You said you wrote that piece yourself, correct?" "Yes," she said gently. "A long time ago. It was never written to be performed. It was just something I played for myself when words weren't enough." The maestro looked at the old sheet of music she carried. "Would you allow me to study it? I'd like to help preserve it, maybe even share it more widely. The world deserves to hear that melody." Clara looked down at the papers in her hands, the edges frayed, the ink faded. She hesitated for a second before replying. "It's not about the world. I just wanted to let it breathe again. It stayed silent too long." Her words carried a kind of peace that made the maestro nod in understanding. "Still," he said softly, "what you've given tonight will stay with people. And that's something rare." Clara smiled again, her eyes kind. "Music is meant to live in people's hearts, not in papers. If someone remembers even one line of it, that's enough." The maestro didn't press further. He could tell that fame wasn't what she wanted. It was enough for her that her melody had found a listener, that it had finally reached the ears it was meant to. When Clara finally stepped outside the hall, the night air greeted her gently. The cool breeze brushed against her face, and she stood under the soft glow of the streetlights for a while, just breathing it all in. Her hands were still slightly trembling, but it wasn't from nerves anymore. It was from the feeling of release. She felt lighter than she had in years. Inside, people were still talking about her. The young performers were asking each other how a simple, quiet woman could play something so powerful. The host, who earlier hadn't even remembered her name properly, now spoke about her with admiration. "That's the kind of moment you don't see often," he said to one of the judges. "She changed the whole atmosphere in that room." The maestro stayed behind long after the event ended. He sat alone, replaying the memory of her melody in his mind. There was something about it that stirred old feelings in him, something he couldn't quite explain. It reminded him why he had fallen in love with music decades ago, before all the competitions and judgments, before the career and reputation. It reminded him of simplicity, of soul. Later that night, when the hall was empty and the lights were dim, he took out his notebook and tried to write down the melody from memory. He could still hear it faintly in his mind, the soft rises, the gentle pauses, the way it ended like a whisper. He smiled to himself. "She played truth," he murmured. The next morning, Clara woke early, as she always did. Her small apartment was quiet, filled with morning light. Her piano stood near the window, old but still beautiful in its way. She sat down and touched the keys softly. They felt familiar, comforting. She began to play the melody again, not as a performance this time, but as a conversation with herself. She thought of the people in that hall, the looks on their faces, the silence before the applause. It warmed her heart to know that for once she had shared something honest and it had been understood. For years she had convinced herself that her music didn't matter, that she was too old or too invisible to be noticed. But that night reminded her that true things never fade. They might go quiet for a while, but they never disappear. As she played, her mind drifted back to the times when music was her only companion. She remembered sitting beside her husband in the evenings, how he used to listen quietly while she played. He would never say much, but his smile told her everything. When he passed away, the piano was the only thing that kept her going. She had written that melody in those lonely nights, pouring her feelings into it because she couldn't speak them out loud. It was her way of holding on to love even when it seemed gone. That's why playing it again at the recital had meant more to her than anyone could ever know. It wasn't about proving herself. It was about honoring a memory, honoring a part of her life that had shaped her. Around noon, there was a knock on her door. When she opened it, the maestro was standing there holding a small folder. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said politely. Clara looked surprised but welcomed him inside. "Not at all," she said. "Please come in." He looked around her small but cozy home. The walls were lined with books, framed photos, and a few old music sheets pinned near the piano. It was a humble place, yet it had warmth. "I couldn't stop thinking about your melody," the maestro admitted. I tried writing it down last night, but I couldn't capture it perfectly. It's too personal. It belongs to you. Clara smiled faintly. It's fine. I never planned to keep it hidden forever, but it was born from quiet moments, not from grand stages. He nodded slowly. I understand. Still, I'd like to offer something. If you ever wish, I could help record it properly. No pressure, no publicity, just so it's preserved. So even when we're gone, that sound remains. Clara looked at him thoughtfully. She appreciated the sincerity in his tone. That would be kind, she said softly. But if it happens, it should stay the way it is. Simple. No big orchestra, no changes. Just a piano and a story. The maestro smiled. Agreed. He stayed for a little while longer. They talked about music, about life, about how sometimes the world overlooks the quiet ones until they finally speak. Clara told him stories from her teaching years, the children she had taught, the little performances she used to organize at the community center. He listened intently, feeling humbled by how someone so unassuming could hold such depth. When he finally left, he said something that stayed with her. You reminded everyone last night what real music sounds like. It's not about being perfect, it's about being honest. After he left, Clara sat by the window again, the sunlight touching her hands as she rested them on the keys. She smiled to herself. She didn't need fame or recognition. Knowing that her music had reached even one person's heart was enough. In the following weeks, the story of the recital quietly spread through town. People spoke of the humble woman who had stunned a hall full of musicians. A few clips recorded by audience members made their way online, where thousands listened and left heartfelt comments. This music feels alive, one wrote. It makes me cry and I don't even know why. Clara didn't pay much attention to all that. She continued with her days as usual, teaching, helping at the local center, playing for small gatherings. But every once in a while she would receive a letter or a small note from someone who had heard her melody, thanking her for it. And every time she read one, she felt that same quiet peace inside her chest. Months later, the maestro visited again, carrying a small recording. He had arranged for her piece to be played exactly as she had performed it. Just a piano, no additions. He handed her a copy and said, "It's yours. This way it'll never be lost." Clara listened to the recording that evening. As the music filled her home, she closed her eyes and felt tears gather. It wasn't sadness, it was gratitude. Gratitude that her music had found its way into the world. And gratitude for all the years that had led her to that moment. When the final note played, she whispered softly to herself. He would have been proud, thinking of her late husband. And she smiled because deep down she knew that somewhere he was. From that day on, Clara never worried about being unnoticed again. She realized that true art didn't need crowds or fame. It just needed honesty. The right ears would always find it, even if it took a lifetime. And though she continued living quietly, her melody lived on, played by students, remembered by listeners, and cherished by the maestro who would never forget the night a humble woman reminded everyone what music truly means.